The Prestige opens with voiceover from John Cutter, played by Michael Caine, explaining the 3 acts of any magic trick. The Pledge, where the magician shows you something ordinary, the Turn, where the magician takes the ordinary object and does something extraordinary, and the Prestige, where he never actually defines what the Prestige is, other than to say that if the magician made something disappear in the turn, the Prestige is where he makes it reappear. So I guess the Prestige is just the resolution of the magic trick, whatever that may mean. Cutter's explanation in the opening is intercut with Alfred Borden, played by Christian Bale, sneaking under the stage during a performance by his professional rival Robert Angier, played by Hugh Jackman, where he inadvertently witnesses Angier's death and therefore implicates himself in Angier's murder. This sequence is effectively the pledge of the movie. It's here to pique our interest and draw us in so that we have buy-in as we see how and why these two men become professional rivals in Act 1 and the escalation and hazards of their professional rivalry in Act 2. And the end of Act 2 is the turn, which makes this already intriguing event extraordinary.
Here at the turn, I must leave you, Borden. Yes, you, Borden. Sitting there in your cell, reading my diary, awaiting your death for my murder.
And the question of how Angier was able to frame Borden for his murder and how Angier could still be alive takes us through Act 3, and we get the explanation, the resolution, the prestige, in the final shot of the movie. But this opening sequence isn't just intriguing because Angier dies in dramatic fashion. The sequence works and effectively draws us in because we, the audience, know that Borden didn't kill Angier. We don't yet know how or why he drowned like this, but we do know that the answer they come up with in the movie...
The tank was brought on for the first trick and then taken off stage. Borden must have placed it under the trapdoor after the interval.
...isn't true. And we know this because of narrative point of view. Narrative point of view is exactly what it sounds like. It's just whose perspective the story is told from. In a macro sense, the narrative point of view is usually just the protagonist. On the whole, we experience the story through the eyes of the main character. But you can also break it down to a scene-by-scene basis, and there it can get a little bit more subtle. Even scenes with multiple characters are usually filtered through the perspective of one character in particular. So in the opening scene, we have Angier performing for a packed house. Even though there are hundreds of characters in this scene, and all of them are focused on Angier, our point of view character is Borden. We follow him on stage, we're with him as he sneaks down below, and we witness Angier's death from Borden's perspective. Notably, this opening scene cuts away to leave the circumstances of his death semi-ambiguous, but eventually, in the third act, we get the full experience of Angier's death through Borden's panicked attempt to prevent it. Narrative point of view is sort of the key to unlocking this movie. It's how the movie is able to layer the narrative and hide its secrets. So, the opening and the aftermath are all from Borden's point of view. He's in prison for Angier's murder and is visited by the solicitor of a mysterious man named Lord Cardlow, who wants to buy all of Borden's tricks. As an act of good faith, the man gives Borden Angier's diary. Borden reads Angier's diary, and the movie cuts to the events described, giving us our first shift in narrative point of view, as we leave Borden behind in his cell and now follow Angier in Colorado seeking an audience with physicist Nikola Tesla. But we're not here long because Angier has his hands on Borden's notebook and is working to decrypt it. As he does, we flash back again to the events described in Borden's notebook, namely Angier and Borden as younger men beginning their careers as magicians. So, just to keep this all straight, we have Borden in prison for Angier's murder in what I'll call Timeline A. We have Angier in Colorado trying to figure out Borden's secrets in what I'll call Timeline B. That's probably a few months before A. And we have Angier and Borden as young magician apprentices in what I'll call Timeline C, presumably years before B. Timeline C is where we spend most of the runtime, as we see their rivalry develop and get ugly. But we periodically return to B and A, until eventually the timeline of C catches up to B, and the timeline of B catches up to A, and then it's Christopher Nolan, what are you going to do? So timeline A is mostly from Borden's point of view. Timeline B is Angier's point of view because it stems from Borden reading Angier's diary. So you would think that timeline C would be from Borden's point of view because the flashback is motivated by Angier reading Borden's notebook, and Borden's voiceover takes us into it.
We were two young men at the start of a great career. Two young men devoted to an illusion. Two young men who never intended to hurt anyone.
But it's not. The bulk of timeline C, and therefore the bulk of the movie, is from Angier's point of view. Yes, this is a movie about a dangerous professional rivalry between two magicians, but really it's about Angier's obsession with Borden.
Go home. Forget this thing. I can recognize an obsession. No good will come of it.
If you understand an obsession, then you know you won't change my mind.
The inciting incident is the death of Angier's wife Julia, which Borden may or may not have been responsible for, an ambiguity that Angier refuses to accept.
You don't know? You don't know?
The beginning of Act 2 is when Angier first sabotages Borden's magic show and demands he answer for the role he may or may not have played in Julia's death.
Which knot did you tie, Borden? Which knot did you tie, Borden?
Around the midpoint-ish, Angier sends his lover Olivia as a spy to Borden's workshop, which leads him to say this.
It won't bring your wife back.
I don't care about my wife, I care about his secret.
And the end of Act 2 is Angier testing out Tesla's machine that may or may not allow him to replicate and surpass Borden's transported man trick. Granted, there are some scenes from Borden's point of view, but in a purposefully limited way. For reasons that are eventually obvious, we the audience are kept at arm's length from Borden. Like, we always know what Angier is thinking and feeling, for the first two acts at least, but that's not remotely the case for Borden. We have absolutely no sense of his inner life. For example, we never really learn how he feels about Julia's death. We're never really sure how he actually feels about his wife Sarah until the final 5 minutes. We don't see any of Borden's inner life because no one does. Early in Act 1, Cutter sends Angier and Borden to see an elderly Chinese magician perform and tasks them with figuring out how he does his goldfish bowl trick. Angier is amazed by the trick, but Borden figures it out immediately. His unconfirmed explanation of the trick is that the seemingly feeble magician is actually strong as an ox, and that his feebleness is just part of his act to sell the trick.
This is the trick. This is the performance. Right here. This is why no one can detect his method. Total devotion to his art. Utter self-sacrifice.
Borden recognizes the life-consuming devotion to the act because he's the same. No one ever gets to see Borden's inner life because that's the sacrifice he's making for his act. Like the Chinese magician, his entire life is his act. Everything he does is for an audience. With this in mind, notice that almost without exception, the scenes from Borden's point of view are him with another character, whether that be Angier, Sarah, Olivia, etc. Even though Borden is the point of view character narratively speaking, these scenes are really just other characters' experience of Borden rather than Borden's perspective on anything. Once you've seen the ending, it becomes clear that these scenes are just Borden performing for different people in his private life. As it turns out, even his notebook is for an audience.
To you, Angier. Yes, Angier. She gave you this notebook at my request.
And just as Angier steals Borden's trick with the transported man, he also steals his fake diary trick.
I must leave you, Borden. Yes, you, Borden. Sitting there in your cell, reading my diary.
While we're privy to everything Angier is thinking and feeling in the first two acts, we're kept more at arm's length for Act 3, because at that point, Angier is keeping everyone at arm's length. He prohibits his longtime engineer from being involved in his show, and instead hires blind stagehands. So even the people working for him aren't in the know on what he's doing. To be honest, this is where the prestige kind of loses me just a little bit. I'm okay with the leap in the willing suspension of disbelief. I'm okay with the metaphor for self-destructive behavior being more than a little on the nose, and I'm okay with the narrative point of view shifting away from Angier. But I'm less okay with how that shift muddles Angier's motivation in this final section. I can track and understand what Angier wants through most of the movie. At first, it's answers about Julia's death, and that evolves into an obsession with Borden himself and how he does his transported man trick, and that evolves into an obsession with doing the trick better. But then he completely loses me here.
Your secret?
Yeah.
You always were the better magician. We both know that. But whatever your secret was, you have to agree. Mine is better.
Don't do this. Don't do this.
At that point, what was all of this for? What is he trying to prove, and who is he trying to prove it to? Is he just trying to prove that he's a better magician than Borden by faking his own death? Because no one even knows that he did that besides the guy who's about to be hanged. So again, what was all of this for? What's Angier's endgame here? In this way, I guess The Prestige is emblematic of how I feel about a lot of Nolan's movies. Ingenious premise, great characters, great set pieces, great production design, but also maybe a little lacking in emotional authenticity, underwritten female characters, a dead wife trope, and a third act that doesn't quite live up to the promise of the first two. Like, I love Inception, but this is my least favorite part. And I absolutely love The Dark Knight, but this is my least favorite part. And don't get me wrong, despite not being fully on board here, I still love The Prestige. I love movies that reward multiple viewings, and it would be impossible for me to recap how many breadcrumbs there are in the first 2/3 of this movie. Suffice to say that basically every scene with Borden, including like 80% of his dialogue, is marked with a giant "this will mean something later" asterisk. It makes the rewatch immensely satisfying.
We were two young men at the start of a great career. Two young men devoted to an illusion. Two young men who never intended to hurt anyone.
And the breadcrumbs go beyond Borden. After Julia drowns to death, Angier tortures himself by trying to simulate the experience, and Cutter tries to comfort Angier by telling him this at Julia's funeral.
I knew an old sailor once. He told me he went overboard, tangled in the sails. They pulled him out, but it took him 5 minutes to cough. He said it was like going home.
But when Cutter learns of the terrible things Angier has done, which includes literally drowning to death every night beneath the stage, Cutter sets the record straight on this anecdote.
I once told you about a sailor who described drowning to me.
As he said, it was like going home.
I was lying. He said it was agony.
Nice touch. But even beyond the setups and payoffs and the twist ending, the movie is just really ingeniously constructed. Using Angier's death and Borden's pending execution as a framing device really elevates the material. And the framing device within the framing device keeps us on our toes in regard to whose perspective we're experiencing this story from. To repeat myself, it uses narrative point of view to layer the narrative and hide its secrets. And for a movie that basically tells you up front that it is itself a magic trick, how appropriate that the narrative works just like a magician does, by meticulously controlling what the audience can see and how we see it. This video is part of a collective called The Director Project. Every month, creators around the world are creating video essays about the work of a single director. Check out the playlist linked in the description below for more videos about the work of Christopher Nolan. And if you want to make your own video, tweet it at CultPopster to be included in the playlist.